Well, I get the high honor of moving the agenda along to our next speaker, and our next speaker is no stranger to this meeting. Brian O'Shaughnessy is recognized as an expert on international trade, having testified before 7 congressional committees, including the only tripartite hearing on trade issues involving 3 congressional committees of the U.S. House of Representatives. During the same session, he also testified before a U.S. Senate Committee on Trade Issues. He was the only person invited to testify at both the House and Senate hearings. O'Shaughnessy served Revere Copper Products as chairman, CEO, and president beginning in 1989. Revere Products produces copper sheet, strip, coil, bus bar that is shipped to other manufacturing companies in a wide variety of industries, including electrical, electronic, transportation, plus building and construction. Today, O'Shaughnessy is focused entirely on trade issues and serves Revere as Senior Vice President for U.S. Trade Policies. O'Shaughnessy has been involved with the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is the premier trade organization in the United States today, and he's been involved with CPA since its founding. He chaired CPA in its early years and currently serves on its executive committee and as treasurer on its board of directors. And I've been honored to get to know Brian over the years as I've been a CPA member for a long time, as Michael Stumo, who helped get it started, is an Iowa boy and went to Iowa State. At the same time, I happened to be there just a few years ago. So with that, I'd like to bring up Brian O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate very much being back here with you again. CPA has been a credible organization, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. But as you know, in many of these presentations that I've given you over the years, I tell a story about a ride on my motorcycle and kind of delve that into my speech. And so I've got a little story for you today about riding on my motorcycle. And about 4.5 years ago, I was a single man, and I met a gal that was really interesting. And so I decided I'd ask her if she wanted to go for a ride in my Harley. Now, I wasn't going to ask her out unless she was interested in going for a ride in my Harley, because I want that kind of a woman that's adventurous. And so she said yes. What I didn't know at the time, she grew up riding on the back of her dad's Harley as a little girl. And so I got lucky. And so it was a fall day, and the foliage where I live, where my ranch is in central New York, my neighbors said it was the prettiest foliage that they had seen in 50 years, all the reds and so on. And so I picked her up on my Harley, and we rode up through the countryside. And it was beautiful. But as we came over a ridge, we looked across the valley, and the colors were just incredible. And she said, "Wow, that is the most beautiful scene." And I said, "Honey, that's my ranch." It was beautiful. Here's a picture. It's not really the one where we were seeing, but because we're in a different area looking across, but you can kind of see here what it's like. And it was just so beautiful. And we, 4.5 years later, we got married. So we got married on August 17th. and a wonderful country wedding. She moved onto my ranch, and of course, I've been a member of RCAF ever since I spoke with you guys 16 years ago. But this shows a little picture here. I don't know, it's a video. Can you make it move or not? I'm not sure. But anyway, because I own a manufacturing company, I just can't run the ranch. So I leased it out to a neighbor. And these are Black Angus and Wagyu beef bred together. And man, it sells good. But my neighbors raise them and own them. And recently they said, we want to make some improvements down there. And it's hard to do that if we're leasing from you. And also we want to build a home on part of your land down there. There's a beautiful place. And it wouldn't be seen from our house. And so we sold them the land January 1st. And so with that, I decided to, Ursula and I went down to a CPA meeting in Florida and then one in New York, or in Washington, excuse me. And we decided that we would, she'd attend the meetings and learn more about trade issues. And she met Bill Bullard there. And so we had a wonderful time. And then Bill, he asked me if I would come by and speak at this convention on tariffs. And so I thought about that, and I said yes. But I knew a lot about tariffs, but I don't know what you know about tariffs. So what I did was I started reading newspapers and articles on tariffs. And then what I did was I cut them out. And I decided to put this presentation together based on the articles that I read in the newspapers. And what I just saw in the articles that I read in the newspapers, the stuff that you guys would read, because these were national articles, and cartoons, was that none of them were accurate in any sense of the word. And so it just stunned me. So what I did is I cut out a bunch of articles and I put together this presentation based on those articles. And so that's what I decided I'd call this The Truth About Tariffs. I'm going to tell you not my opinion. I'm going to tell you what the facts are, what the truth is about tariffs. I'm going to tell you good things about tariffs, and I'm going to tell you bad things about tariffs. Because that's just the way it is. They're not all bad, they're not all good. And so let's start with this political cartoon that I carved out. Now, I just want to show you a couple of things here in this cartoon. See, it's a showroom of a car dealership. Here's the customer, USA. Here's the dealer, and he says, and this little beauty is 100% made in America. There's 4 items on this that I want to focus on. The first is a Smoot Hawley down here. You see over here, Smoot Hawley. The second is trade war. The third is up here. It's hard to make this out. It's a tire, and instead of saying good year, that tire says bad year on it. And then the fourth thing is, right up here is a price. And you can see that price is like $99,000 for a pile of junk. So this whole cartoon is making fun of tariffs. But every single one of those 4 points is wrong. I'm going to tell you the truth. Let's start with Smoot-Hawley. What is Smoot-Hawley? It's a bill passed in 1930 that increased tariffs. It applied to 1/3 of the trade, not 1/3 of our gross national product, not 1/3 of all our business, 1/3 of our trade, of our international trade. It increased tariffs from 45 to 53%. Now, doesn't it amaze you, first of all, that in 1930 the tariffs were 45%? And then they were increased to 53. Not much of an increase. Tariffs were actually higher than that 53 from 1821 to 1914. Doesn't that amaze you? No previous increase in tariffs caused a recession or even a depression. So what drove the depression? It started with the stock market crash in 1929. The US Fed allowed the money supply to balloon in the last 4 years of the 1920s. This caused a huge bubble in the stock market. We all know what happens when there's a bubble in the stock market. The bubble popped. The stock market crashed, and the depression began. The Fed then cut the money supply by 1/3. So think of this. They had too much money. People were just taking money because the interest rates were nothing, putting it in the stock market. It crashes. The economy needs money then to get out of the depression, and then they cut the money supply by 1/3. Depriving the economy of needed liquidity. Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for Economics after proving the Fed's mismanagement of the money supply caused the depression. The truth. The US Fed's mismanagement of the money supply caused the depression and prolonged it, not the increased tariffs. That's the first point about that political cartoon. Now let's look at the second point here, the trade war. Over here, you see the trade war. First, let's talk about mercantilism, maybe a foreign concept or word to you, some may understand. But it's a type of economic policy that a nation follows if you manage your economy to go faster than competing nations. You want your economy to grow faster than the economies of other competing nations in international trade. You do that with trade policies that protect and support domestic production. You want to win the international trade war for higher paying jobs and a strong, growing middle class. So you're not trying to do a win-win. You're trying to win for your country because you want the higher paying jobs in your country. You want the strong, growing middle class in your country. That's what mercantilism is. It's a positive trade balance. It means you become export dependent, not import dependent. Think about how import dependent we are today. Here's the history of world trade. No country in the history of the world ever became a major economy practicing free trade. None, not ever. Isn't that amazing? But it's true. Every country that ever became a major economy practiced mercantilism. That's what we did. Here's the U.S. trade history. Pre-FDR, the USA practiced mercantilism. Then Eisenhower modified free trade with 2 tariffs for geopolitical concerns. What he did was he was trying to keep the Western Europe and Japan out of the communist bloc after World War II. Their factories, they were destroyed in the war, so there were no threat to our factories if we practiced free trade after World War II. But this 1960s and 70s saw growing protectionism abroad. U.S. corporations began outsourcing. Why? They had distribution channels in the United States. They moved their supply chains and production abroad behind those protective barriers. Doesn't that make sense for them to do that? And of course, those barriers include things like currency manipulation, customs barriers. Let me give you an explanation of what I mean when I talk about customs barriers. Do you remember when baseball bats went from wooden bats to aluminum? Would you understand this, that when the American companies that produced those aluminum bats tried to ship them into Japan, the customs agents in Japan found reasons why they just couldn't accept them. There was no law, no nothing. They just gave them the stiff arm. And this went on for 2 years. And during that 2 years, Japanese aluminum producers learned how to make and produce aluminum bats and flooded the market in Japan with Japan-produced aluminum bats. And then the customs agents said, okay, America, you can ship your bats in. See, there's lots of ways to practice mercantilism. In addition, of course, you have tariffs and BATs, value-added taxes. Let's talk about value-added taxes for a minute. The average VAT in the world is 20%. When a country has a VAT tax, we don't. Every other country in the world does. Well, what they do is they tax imports and they tax domestic production that, let's say, average 20%. So you think, well, wow, if they tax their domestic production as well as imports, that's even, that's fair. But what they do is they take the money from the proceeds and then they subsidize the domestic production. I know in the case of my industry in China, they took those proceeds, and if another brass mill or copper mill like Revere in China expanded production and needed money to expand, they gave it to them for free. Germany increased their value-added tax from 16 to 19% at one point, and they gave it back to the manufacturing companies to reduce their payroll taxes. So they increased the VAT, but for domestic producers, they didn't have to pay that increase because it was offset. And then they rebate the VAT for exporting production. So if you sell your product domestically, you don't get the rebate. But if you sell it foreign, ship it foreign, you get the rebate. So you see how you organize things to benefit your domestic economy. And think about it for a minute. How perfect a world is it for all of them if they all have value-added taxes and we don't? If we're the only one that doesn't. It's like perfect for everybody else. So I don't call it a value-added tax, I call it a value-added tariff. So when you hear somebody say a VAT tax is like a tariff, it is. That's the truth. Look at these companies with the largest trade deficits in the United States in 2024. This group is the first group, and we have major trade deficits with these countries. The second group, not quite as big of deficits as the first group, but pretty damn big. I'm actually surprised that Japan wasn't up at the top. All of these countries have much higher tariffs than the United States. So when people say to you, oh, those tariffs, they're so bad, why does everybody else have tariffs? Why do we have the lowest tariffs? That's a good question to ask somebody if you ever get in a debate about tariffs. And these tariffs, of course, include VATs. Remember I said the average VAT was 20% in the world. That's right off the bat. And that leaves out their regular tariffs. And what happens with all of these? We lose high-paying middle-class jobs. Half of all ranchers have shut down since 1980. 50,000 manufacturing plants have shut down since 2000. Cities and towns are decimated. You get increased depression, divorce, drugs, and crime. And we've all seen that. That's what happens when jobs disappear. High-paying, good jobs disappear, and towns are decimated. The middle class is destroyed. That's leaving the haves and haves not to fight and riot. Let me just share with you for a minute a personal experience I had in this. Back in 1980, I ran an electrolytic copper refinery in Baltimore, Maryland. 25% of our workforce was black. We had black supervisors. We had a plant where there was no racial tension at all. None. And we had workers for inner city Baltimore. That plant, I was there for 2 years, and when I left, it was in great shape. But then Japan, and then it was followed by China, started taking mercantile actions that moved the copper smelting and electrolytic refining to Japan and to China. And that plant shut down. Now, can you imagine, remember when we had the riots in Baltimore and the black cities and the black areas. Can you imagine my feelings thinking about the children rioting of the people that worked in my plant without any race hatred or bias? I get passionate about trade and what it does to America when it's done wrong. So I come back to that cartoon. Is it the USA that is starting a trade war? I want to share you another article. I know you can't read it. I just put it on there. I summarized it here because it talks about the German chancellor. And when Trump put on all of these tariffs, he said they have no desire to ignite and I emphasized, an all-out trade war that could hobble the European Union's export-dependent economy. So, all-out trade war, not a trade war. And all out is what I want to focus on here. We've been in a trade war for 40 plus years. We've been practicing free trade since just before World War II. While the rest of the world, except the UK, has been export dependent. They're shipping way more out than they're taking in. To me, that's akin to disarmament. If someone is shooting at you and you're not shooting back, you're still in a war. So when he talked about the German chancellor about starting an all-out trade war, what he was really saying is, it's okay if we war on you, but don't war back on us. So I go back to this trade war. This cartoon is saying that we're starting, that our tariffs are causing a trade war. No. We're finally fighting back. I also want to talk about how important tariff design is, because if a tariff is short-term, it only helps revenue. Long-term tariffs drive decision-making. If you're going to expand your ranch, your production, if you see a tariff that might go away in a year or two, you're not going to do that. So that takes us to this other point on the tires. It says, it should say good year, but it says bad year. And it's a knock on the tariffs we put on tires. Obama did that. It was a good move, except it were short-term tariffs. They would expire after a certain time frame. So they didn't work. So tariffs don't always work, especially if they're short term. But let's also talk for a minute about the price of this car, this old jalopy. $99,000 is what that says. So the message to you in this cartoon is the tariffs are going to cause the prices to increase out of sight. So let's talk about how tariffs really work and the impact that tariffs have on prices. First, let's understand the categories of tariffs. The Section 232 tariffs are product specific. These tariffs gave the president the power to tariff for national security. So when Trump put the tariffs on steel and aluminum, he's arguing that steel and aluminum are important to our national security. And the Section 232 of this law gave him the ability to apply tariffs. You see, the Constitution gives the House and the Senate the ability to apply tariffs. The only way the president could apply it is if they passed a law that said he could in the case of national security, which they did. And so he applied it in that way. Now, we all understand and know that we need those 232 tariffs applied to beef and to copper and to a lot of other things. And so CPA is working on that right now to try to get those tariffs applied to beef and to copper and to many other products. Now, you've also probably heard a lot about reciprocal tariffs. Reciprocal tariffs sound good, but they never worked. A reciprocal tariff means we go to another country and say, you knock your tariffs down to 0, we'll knock our tariffs down to 0. Or you knock yours to 5, we'll knock ours to 5, or whatever. Of course, we're actually lower than that. But what happens then is you get other non-tariff functions happening, like we talked about the customs agents. And there's so many other ways that other countries use so that the reciprocal tariffs have never worked. We've had that in the past. We've done that. We've tried that, but they have never, ever worked. I mean, think about it. You're competing with ranches in foreign countries that have cheap labor. They don't have the standards you have. They don't treat the animals as you do. They don't get the quality that you do. And so they underprice you with no tariffs. So this whole thing about reciprocal tariffs, it's not going to work. Then there's tariffs known as ad valorem tariffs. These are tariffs that are on a percentage of the value of the product that's being imported. Now, there's a problem with that because the importer has to tell the government, the U.S. government, what that value is. And of course, they value it low, meaning that the tariff doesn't have much of an effect. In addition, then there's specific tariffs. These are tariffs that are fixed dollar amounts. So if you're importing a cow, it's a dollar amount. Well, maybe it's better to understand it this way. If you're importing an automobile, and let's say you're importing a very inexpensive automobile or a more expensive, the tariff may be $5,000. So it makes it hard for them to play games on the price, but there's still a weakness in that. And so then probably a better solution is what is called a compound tariff. It's a combined ad valorem and a specific, but it only applies if they're over a quota. So you set a quota of the amount of beef that can be imported, and you don't do this just by country, you do it worldwide. And when you do that, you set that quota, and then you apply the ad valorem tariffs and the specific tariffs. That works. And these tariffs can be global or country specific. And it's much better when they're global, because you get all of these situations where you put a tariff on one country, and then what happens is they ship to this other country that then ships here. And so you got to do these things on a global basis, and then they work. The types of tariffs by amounts: there's revenue tariffs, and there's protective tariffs. Revenue tariffs are up to about 20–25%. They don't really protect much. You need to be over 25%. You need to have tariffs like we used to, about 40–50%. And then there's negotiating tariffs. These are tariffs like if China is trying to screw us and you tell them, well, I'm putting a tariff of 250% on you. That's a negotiating tariff. That's not going to stay. He's just putting that out there to achieve another objective. And tariffs are not like sales taxes. You hear this. I heard this a lot. And sales taxes are applied at the cash register. The tariffs are applied at the border. The foreign producers can eat part of the tariffs. So the foreign producer wants to keep their market share. So let's say they were selling for $100, their costs are $50, they drop their price by $20. And so that, nowhere is it near like a sales tax. That reduces the foreign income, including the GDP, because if that company is getting less money, the government is getting less taxes, and the foreign country and its citizens are paying. So if you hear somebody say, we're going to put a tariff on and they're going to pay for it, they certainly are going to pay for a good part of it, because that's the way the world works. They don't want to lose their market share, they cut the price. And what happens? Then companies that are outsourced are suffering. This impacts the stock market. So all those globalist companies are going to squawk and squeal. Expect it. There are economic models that all US economists use, one of two models, to forecast outcomes. Like in this model, you put in a change in the tax, and it tells you what's going to happen to employment, what's going to happen to inflation, and so on. Or you put in a tariff and what's going to happen. Well, these economic models, both of them have been consistently wrong forecasting the impact of tariffs. They ignored the positive impact of tariffs on the economy. What are those positive? CPA then, what we did is we improved the econometric model. And we did that, we hired one of the original software designers of the econometric model. And we used actual historic data, because there were times when we had tariffs and we could go back and see what the change was. And so then using that historic data, the actual impact of effective tariffs on domestic production Capital investment means new construction. Employment and wages increase with better jobs. Income increases more than inflation. That's what happened in the past. Domestic profits went up and foreign profits went down of global corporations. The tax revenues would increase. Productivity would increase and driving GDP up. So what did we do? CPA, we ran this new model over 10 years, and we assumed 20% tariffs on the world and 60% on China. And here's the results. The federal government income went up by $7 trillion. Inflation went up incrementally, 2% in the early years, and then it decreased to zero. Why did it decrease to zero? Because of the tariffs, we had increased domestic production, and then they start competing, and then the price went down because of the competition. And this comes back to what our earlier speaker was saying. We really need good antitrust legislation and enforcement. When our country grew to become the power that it was, we had high tariffs and we had high antitrust enforcement. That's what drove our economy. Household incomes go up by $12,000 in real money over inflation. GDP went up incrementally, about 1% a year. So, you want to talk about that price? And this cartoon just didn't happen that way. Here's JP Morgan's assessment of tariffs. Raises prices, cut profits, diminish productivity, increase global tensions, increase unemployment, and worsens inequality. Let's talk about those last two. Increase unemployment, worsens inequality. I saw this article, it came. And what I'm highlighting there is that there's a gal she's running this program called Moms in Need, or Walking with Moms in Need. And what they did here is what she's saying, they have all kinds of kids in America that don't have shoes. And so why not? Because our city of Fulton, that's in New York, they've lost their industrial base, therefore there are fewer jobs and a much higher level of poverty. It's the opposite of what JP Morgan is saying. You know? So there they go. That's what they say. It's just so wrong. So the Coalition for a Prosperous America and RCAF, we're punching way beyond our weight. Our leader of CPA is now working in the White House. He nominated 12 other people throughout the administration that got jobs. We are infiltrating the government. The previous speaker talked about doing that with RCAF. And he's so right. We need to infiltrate the government. Our opponents are very well funded, unbelievably well funded. Your financial support of RCAF and the support of CPA is so incredible, and we're punching way beyond what we say. We have dedicated, hardworking people, and I've enjoyed working with Bill. He's just such an effective spokesman in Washington. I've been with him there for the years. We have a big wall to climb, but together, we got this. Thank you. I'd be glad to take any questions. It's kind of hard to see when the lights are on here. I know we got lunch, but
There's one over here. Hold on.
Okay.
I was wondering if we done what we've done for the sheep industry when we lost that incentive payment on the wool and lamb. Why, that was a basic, along with 1080 poison, that was death to the sheep business.
Yeah, we've lost some battles along the way, and that was a huge mistake. And I just really can't say anything more, but we just have to keep pressing forward on what we're doing. We need tariffs to protect the sheep industry. We need tariffs to protect all domestic industry in this country, and that's what we're aiming to do.
Thanks for all the work you and Bill have done.
Thank you. He's quite a guy. There's a question over here.
Robert Gore, Oklahoma, cow-calf rancher. On our cow herd, we're down to just under 28 million at 17.9 million cows, which I think that's where we need to be. The foreign countries have, on their imported beef, their quota, they pay a 2% tariff. If they go over the quota, they pay a 26% tariff. And Brazil, for an example, as was mentioned earlier, over the last 3 years has imported way over their quota, paying the 26%, which tells me our tariffs are way too low on imported beef. We domestically produce about half the beef consumed in the United States, and so the other half needs to be imported to meet the consumer demand, but they're undercutting us in price. That's why, because our herd's down to under 28 million, is why we're getting these better prices that we've experienced in the last few years. And they're not great prices, they're the highest we've ever had, but I consider them just better prices because of everything we buy has increased so much, our cost of production. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, sir.
Yeah, well, I think there's two issues you brought up there. The first is, it sounds to me like the quotas are not being enforced. And that's not just in beef. It's in various parts of various steel products from Mexico. The quotas are not being enforced. And so we just need better people in our government that are going to enforce those quotas as they should. And we've got better people in many areas, but we don't have a lot better people as the Secretary of the Treasury. I don't know that we've got a whole lot better than the Secretary of Ag either. We don't have that. And then the other thing you brought up on the tariffs, as I mentioned in my presentation, a protective tariff, a revenue tariff is a tariff that's up to about 20%. So a tariff of 25%, that isn't a protective tariff. It doesn't protect you. We need protective tariffs. And so that's why we need tariffs of 40 to 50%. And by the way, CPA had a meeting with the Secretary of Commerce, who seems to be on our side. And we said to the Secretary of Commerce, hey, those steel tariffs of 25%, they're just revenue tariffs. They're not protective as they should be. And the Commerce Secretary agreed with us. And guess what happened? The next day, Trump increased the steel and aluminum tariffs, doubled them. Yeah. So CPA is gaining power, but we need to spread that power across all industry, all agriculture, all mining, and all services. We need to bring the production of all of that here to this country, because we don't want a win-win situation in the world when they're killing us. We want to win the international trade war that we're in. And to do that, we have to fight back. And to do that, we need your help. Thank you.